So welcome everyone. In today's video, I'm going to show you how I made this, let's call it unrefined bullnose smoothing plane. All right, let's go ahead and get started. And I'm going to begin making this plane by cutting up some ambrosia maple. So it's basically maple that has some character to it. And ultimately this is for a prototype, so I'm not too worried about the character. My plan overall is to leave this fairly unrefined. Again, prototype, and the idea behind this is basically, build with speed. I'm going to cut out everything that isn't critical, and I want to test out some ideas, and there's no sense in making it look pretty if that doesn't meet my end goal. First thing you saw me doing there was squaring up and flattening one edge and one face. Those are my reference surfaces, and then I took it over to the table saw to get the rest of it. And you can see here is the pattern I will be working towards. But it was at this point that I remembered that ambrosia maple is soft maple, not hard maple. And soft maple, yeah, it works, but it's not the best for hand planes. Hard maple would be preferable. So what I'm doing now is cutting some purple heart. I'm going to use that as an insert for the mouth, and it'll be a little more hard wearing because that's where most of the wear primarily will be, is right around the mouth. So purple heart will make this plane last a little while longer. Just back over in the table saw, and I am just milling out a slot there, and then now I'm using a router plane to flatten it out. And this slot is oversized simply because it didn't need to be a tight fit. The front of this plane is essentially getting chopped off. Now once all that's glued in and allowed to set up, I can go back to the bandsaw, get back on track here, and start cutting out the plane's shape. This plane is based on a Marple's bullnose plane, and I kind of had an idea on how I might want to make my own, and that's why I'm going through this exercise. One of my goals is to essentially make like the perfect quote unquote bullnose smoothing plane. And this is just a different style. I've made a few others in the past, and there were some things I didn't like about them, so I'm trying a radically different design and seeing if that helps get me closer to my goal. So now once the plane was roughed out, I turned my attention to the mouth. I kind of just chiseled down a little bit, and now I can come back in with a drill and just kind of free up some of that material, and then back to the chisels to excavate what had been drilled. This is going to be the start of the escapement, essentially. And, this is just a weirdly shaped hand plane, and it kind of changes the way that I would normally do things compared to like a wooden coffin smoother or something like that. But it's just back and forth between the chisels. I'm working kind of from both directions to get that area free. And I leave this pretty rough. In the meantime, I'll refine it later. But I'm just going to kind of go back and forth. And now I'm over at my little mini mill. I'm going to use this to start the bed. And I have an extra long milling bit in here that I reserved strictly for wood. And I think my bed angle on this was about 35 degrees. It might have been 40, but I'm pretty sure it was 35. That's what I can comfortably get in the mill and still get some clearance. And I just kind of worked back and forth until I got down to my line, and you'll notice it doesn't go all the way through. So now I can come back in with a chisel and connect what I had drilled out earlier and the rest of that bed. And I can use what was established with the mill as a guide for the chisel. On larger hand planes, I've used essentially a block of wood that was cut to a specific angle, clamp it to the back, and I can use that as a chisel guide to make sure I'm getting that bed perfectly flat and at the angle I want. With a smaller one, it's a little harder to do that, so I find being able to use a mill to cut that bed very beneficial. One of my books I have, they show using a drill press in a similar manner. With it was either with a milling bit or with a router bit. I'm not quite sure. I'd have to go look. So anyway, there you just saw me. I essentially cut the front of this plane off. This is a little bit oversized. I'm going to come back in later, chisel out some of that extra material, and then put a steel plate on to act as the front, and that is going to be that. But that's a future step. Currently, I'm coming in and I need to establish the abutments for that are going to hold the wedge. And I have this flush cut saw that's and just coming in there and cutting first along the bed, and then I stick a wedge in there that is to the correct thickness and angle that would represent the amount of distance I have with the blade I'm going to use and what I want my wedge to be, and then I can use that to establish the other cut I was going to make, and then it's back in with small chisels. That's a 1/8 inch chisel I'm using to get all of that material out of the way so I can actually get a fit up with my blade and my wedge. Now, excuse my whittling skills. I didn't feel like really making this plane overly refined, and so I'm just using a knife there to kind of slightly round over the edges, just so it's a little more comfortable to use. I'm going to leave all those facets. I'm not too worried about that. And then on the back and then the front of the plane, and I think on the top too, I basically just left all the bandsaw marks. And just another experimentation in texture. And honestly, after I got to using this plane a little bit, I really like the bandsaw marks. It adds some grip to the plane, and you can really kind of lock it into your hand. So I might have to try that on some other planes. All right, so now it's time to make the wedge. I'm gonna just use some more of that maple that I was using on the body, and this wedge actually has to be pretty small, and so I cut a bulk of the material away on the bandsaw. Again, I left the bandsaw texture on the back of that blade. It worked. I wasn't too concerned about it. But after this is cut out, I'm going to go ahead and take it over to the mill and just get that smoothed out. I want this wedge to be of a consistent size, and I'm just going to mill this at, I think this was a 10-degree wedge I decided on. And this just makes it easy to get things all in the same plane. You certainly do not need a mill to do any of this. I was just lazy on this day. And now it's back over to the bandsaw. I can cut out, I guess, that center section and establish an area for the shavings to go so they don't get jammed up in the the abutments, at the end of the abutments for the wedge. I'm just working a bulk of that material out with the bandsaw blade. And I just put a teeny little tiny chamfer on it here. I'm mostly just cleaning that up with a chisel. And I'm not going to do too much more than that. So now it's time to work on the front of the plane, and I make these hook rules, which is what I was showing you there. Those are available for sale, by the way, shameless self-promotion. But in making them out of these old framing squares, I have a good chunk of steel left over that is not useful for a ruler, and it's just kind of sitting around taking up space in the shop. So I'm going to use that for the front plate of this hand plane. I'm just going to go ahead and leave all of the rule marks on it. I'm not too worried about it, but I took it over to the mill to just clean off the sides after rough cutting it on a bandsaw. And it got drilled for the screw holes, and then I'm just going to go ahead and clean up that face a little bit, give it a maker's mark. And then, let's see how it gets installed. I went ahead and stuck it down to that plane so it doesn't move, and then I'm drilling the holes and installing the screws, and I make sure I clock them, because in doing so, everyone knows that the plane gets a +5 bonus to the coolness factor. And I also went ahead and I just left this oversized, and I'm just going to flush it up to the sole with some files. And one thing I also made sure to do, I found this on other hand planes, is the very front edge of that mouth plate, I go ahead and round over, and it keeps it from wanting to try to dive bomb into the wood. And so now I'm over on my surface plate, and I'm using that to help flatten the bottom. That whole box assembly is another project I had and I made a video on. I'll leave that in the link for that up top there. Now it's on to some boiled linseed oil, just because. And here is the finished result. You can see some of that texture that was left behind. You can see multiple marks. So there's that texture I was talking about along the backside, and then my knife rounding over. There's the front plate, a little close up on that. The inside marked as a prototype. And then you can see some of my additional lines, because I got things mismeasured when I was doing all my layout. Didn't bother removing those. There's the blade. I had made a bunch of blades for another project. This one I did not bother to clean off any of the scale from hardening it, except on the back right along that cutting edge there. And yeah. So this is it in all of its unrefined glory. And let's go ahead and put it to work. And it takes a shaving, so I'm real happy with how it's turned out performance-wise. It's doing exactly what I wanted it to do. One of my suspicions, and it was confirmed, was that this would be easier to get started because you have a place where you can put some downward pressure on the front of the plane. Some of the other ones I had made, getting them started can be a little difficult to get that blade to engage, and this kind of solves that issue. And so, yeah, it took a beautiful shaving. I'm real happy with that aspect of the design. So I'm going to go ahead, let me demonstrate how this works. If you are planing into a corner, which is where these often would be used, a regular plane can only get so close. So let me go ahead and mark this up so you can kind of see a little better what's going on. Planing into that corner, you got a regular plane, and it's going to leave whatever the distance between the front of the plane and the start of that blade is. But with a bullnose plane, you can get in a lot closer to that corner and get more of that area smoothed up. And especially here doing a chamfer along the side, this is where it really shines. Again, you can establish a bulk of that chamfer with a regular hand plane and then come in with a bullnose, getting extremely close to that corner, and then there's just a teeny little bit that you might have to get with a chisel. Now, one of my other suspicions was that I wouldn't be able to necessarily get as close to a corner due to that nose being pitched forward than some of the other bull noses I've made where the nose is pitched back. So while it was easier to start, it does reduce some of its, I guess, corner cutting capacity. So it's a trade-off. I do have an idea in mind that likely will kind of solve all of the issues, but this was a major step forward. And then I went ahead and I made a few more. This one here, I went ahead and polished up, gave it all the refinements. This is going to be a Secret Santa gift for someone, and it is arriving as this video is being published. So hopefully they enjoy it. And I kept a couple for myself, and that means that the one that you followed along with the building of is available. If you might want it, I will go ahead and put it up for sale on the website. So thank you for tuning in and following along. I sincerely appreciate it. And I will catch you on the next one.